Buenos dias. Good morning. It's 8:28. 8:28. One phone is brighter, one phone is darker, but it's time. Oh, all right. It's time to join in. It's time to make bread. Why? Who's here to make bread? Who's here that followed last night and who got ready? We got a couple of minutes, so I'm gonna wait for people to kind of like jump in, and then we start talking about it. Excuse the look. You know what? I'll get rid of the raggedy sweater. At least that. 9-inch nails, man. Okay. Let's get rid of this. I have tried to set up my station on my marble table because you could have had a wider view, but because I'm doing everything on my own with this phone rig, it's impossible for me to pan and look around. So I stayed where I was yesterday, at least to get a little bit of a depth of field, and I can bring the ingredients in front of you. How's it going with your starter? Are you guys, do you have your starters ready, or do you have your dry yeast ready? Do you have your flour ready? I noticed yesterday that the framing of the two phones that I'm using is a little different, so I will try to show you the ingredients right centered in front of my chest, so I make sure that everything looks proper. Okay, so last night, not yet, come on. 8:29, just 1 minute left. Wow, so many people. Luca from Italy, ciao Frassini, come stai? Okay, so it is 8:30. It's 8:30 and we are starting to mix the bread. Because I was drinking, as usual, last night, I didn't talk too much about the starter. I talked about the difference between the starter, the mother dough, and the dry yeast, but I did not give any instructions on how to prepare, how to give birth to a starter, okay? So the starter is a 100% hydration mix. What does it mean? That for one part of flour, you do have one part of water. And what happens is that you're basically starting a culture, a bacterial culture. So you just get one container, plastic or glass, depending on your preference, but I haven't noticed big difference. And on day one, you mix, let's say, 50 grams of water and 50 grams of flour. After 24 hours, you discard 80% of that mix, you save a couple of tablespoons. You toss all the rest and you add again 50 grams of water and 50 grams of flours. As the days go by, the bacterial population will start growing. You're feeding it, right? You're giving carbs, you're giving water, you're giving nutrients to your starter, which means that eventually you'll start noticing some fermentation. And the fermentation will appear in the form of bubbles. This is my starter. This starter is a few years. But regardless, starter always looks the same. We discussed that yesterday. It is nice to say I have a starter that is 100 years old. The reality is that bacteria do not live for 100 years unless you freeze them or you preserve them somehow. So this is an ever-growing population. This is something that happens on a cycle that is depending on the strain of the bacteria that is inside. So at best, if you have a 100-year-old starter, you might have a strain of bacteria that is 100 years old. Even that is really not accurate because you mix it with different spoons, because you get flour that comes from different places, water that comes from different places. Sometimes you change the container, so the bacteria collects whatever comes from around the environment and becomes like your own personal mix. So, as far as I'm concerned, there is no starter in existence that is older than 24 hours. That is my take, okay? So this is my starter. On your 10th day of your starter, it should look like something like this. Now I'm gonna tilt it and then everything is gonna pour out. Let me see if I can show you with a spoon. It's probably better. So this is a bubbly, all right? Bubbly. It smells slightly vinegary, but not completely. It has to show a few bubbles on the side, but the most important thing is the stringiness. Okay, it has to be extremely stringy. And now I'll show you what is the test that you have to do to make sure that your starter or your levain is in good health. Let's talk for a moment about the hydration of the bread. This is very important because there's a different level of hydration of bread, and the more the hydration increases, the harder it becomes to handle the dough. Okay, it will stick to your fingers, it will stick to all your surfaces. Another note is that I do not use a machine. I like to get my dough under my nails and then stick it to my hands. I like to mix by hand. It's something that makes me happy. So yes, you can mix this in a mixer. I don't recommend it. I find it useless, and I live in Brooklyn, so I cannot keep you know, a big KitchenAid out just because I'm making bread every single day. I'd rather do it by hand. So the hydration of the bread is a simple mathematic formula. You divide the weight of your water by the weight of the flour that you're using, and you multiply per 100. Considering that we are working with a levain that has 100% hydration, meaning 50% water and 50% flour, the ratio here is 1 to 1, so you don't need to consider that. So you only calculate between the water that you're using for the mixer and the flour that you're using. We're using 350 grams of water, lukewarm water, so room temperature, and 500 grams of flour. Once everything is multiplied, and you know, water divided flour times 100, it makes 70%. 70% is really, I would say, the limit that you do have between a dough that really sticks to your hands and something that you can work more like a pizza dough, something that you can stretch with your hand without having fear of having, you know, residue or stuff that sticks to your hands constantly, which is a pain in the ass. However, working with doughs that are this wet requires a certain level of commitment. Do not get scared, and also act quickly. You cannot just like keep your hand in too much, especially when we get to the fold, and we'll talk about it later, you know, in our later connections during the day. So let's talk about the ingredients that we have. What we have to do right now is fairly easy. We mix the leaven in the water, we dissolve it, we add the flour, we add the salt, we mix it, and then we put it in the oven. So let me do the first thing. If your oven has the setting for bread proof, which this has, which is the only setting that really excites me, go ahead and start with that. If you do not have a bread proofing setting, turn on the light. If you have them both, turn it on both. Now, what happened here last night? This is why we discussed it yesterday. This is my temperature, hygrometer, and everything. So right now the humidity in my house is 39%, which is fair. It's a crappy weather though. The thermal excursion has been from 64 degrees at night to 75 degrees, which was probably last night when I was baking bread and I had the kitchen going. This is 10 degrees. It's fairly acceptable, but in order for both a starter and a dough to be healthy, you should try to stay above 70 degrees. The bread proofing is 100. It is not accurate. All these kind of machines have different settings and different temperature, and they measure the stuff the way they want it. One final note about the starter. There are several ways to maintain your starter, and it depends on the cycle. Depends on the force feeding cycle and how you decide that you want your starter to work. Some starters make big bubbles. They grow a lot within 24 hours. My starter is a little bit more of a punk starter. It's a very rebellious. The feeding cycle is actually 12 hours and not 24 hours. It gets hungry really fast, it consumes it really fast, and the bubbles that it makes are really more on the champagne side. If you notice the cut of bread that I did last night, I do not get usually a sourdough that has these gigantic bubbles, but a uniform, nice and fluffy loaf. If you want to see breads that are better than mine, just go on Instagram, look for Mike Donahue 61, which I'm so incredibly jealous. Mike is a friend, we've done tons of festivals together, and he's a much better bread maker than me, so I suggest you go look for your stuff. There is also a fellow in Australia, it's called the Tuscan Baker, and he does amazing sourdough and also amazing croissants, which is something else that I would like to do one day. Alright, so let's talk about the ingredients. Let's make this dough, and then we'll have some coffee, and then we'll meet again in a half hour for the first fold, and then around lunchtime for the bench rest, okay? Alright, so I do have my 350 grams of water. I hope you took this time to weigh all your ingredients, okay? So if you're going by my recipe or your recipe, you know, I hope that everything is done. I don't want to put stuff on the scale in front of you. A note, if you're not using a starter or a mother dough, this is the moment to add dry yeast to your water, mix it up properly, wait a little bit, and then as it starts foaming on top, then you can start the mix. You can adjust the flour. Probably you have to increase a little bit of flour to make a dough that is workable. but the technique that I use and the process stays the same, so it really doesn't change much. However, sourdough, it's much better in my opinion, has a better flavor, and it does not retain the yeasty flavor that dry yeast sometimes give. So the most important thing when it comes to checking the health of your starter for your bread, and the first indicator of what's going to happen at the end of the day to your bread, is the floating of the starter. The starter has to be rich in gas, right? That's what makes the bread fluff up. So if your starter is not healthy and is a little dead, once you put it into the water, it will tend to go to the bottom. You want a starter that just like spreads on top and just like floats, almost like, you know, a little, you know, just floats like oil on water. Okay, so I'm going to add most of my starter. We mixed it last night. I did 80 grams. So I'm looking to pour in about 120 grams. Do not overdo it, otherwise your bread will proof a little too fast, and also you risk to add a little bit of acidity to your bread, which is something that you don't want. Okay, so let's see if, okay, can do it from here. You see? And what is left inside here is what I'm going to feed once I'm done. Another 50 grams and 50 grams, or if I want to bake again tomorrow. But my starter has a 12-hour cycle, so I can feed it now 50 grams and 50 grams, and then tonight, in case I want to make bread tomorrow morning, I'll give it again, you know, discard most of it and give it again, you know, 80-80 or something like that. Okay, so this, everything is falling. So this is how it has to look. I hope you can see it. You see it? Try not to incline it so it doesn't fall. But the starter floats on the water, and it has to have this milky consistency, okay? This is not a dough. This is just a concoction, okay? So you get your hands inside. I'm gonna put it down, okay? So if you have any questions, it's hard for me to talk and keep track of two different feeds, but whatever question you have, drop it in the comments on Facebook or on Instagram, and then throughout the day, I'll make sure that I respond to everything. So with your hand, and make sure that the water is lukewarm. Lukewarm means it does not give you a temperature read once you put your hand in it. You cannot tell if it's cold, if it's warm, so something close to body temperature. This is people do yoga in the morning. I make bread. This is a fantastic way for me to relax, meditate. Okay, so what happens now that is all done, you do have this nice water. It almost looks like a mozzarella water. You can feel the slight slime texture inside the water, but not completely. And the smell is nice and buttery and soft and sexy. It's a really hard smell to describe. It's soothing. It's a mix between a cream and a cheese. It's soft fermentation smell. Okay. All right. So about the flour. Remember, we talked yesterday about bread flours, and I realized that I did not show you properly what I'm using. This is the flour that I'm using. Unfortunately, it's a small package. This is a double O bread flour, Italian. The only recommendation that I do have, there's two recommendations. The first one is try not to use heavy processed flour. Heavy processed flour and bleached flour, and sometimes also the all-purpose flour, are stripped down in the ingredients, overly processed, so they don't help you, they don't help your starter because there's not enough nutrients, and also they make a bread that is like really a little too white. This technique and all the work that we're doing here is really extreme basic work. Once you get the technique, you feel free to switch the flour. You can use a spelt, you can use grain, you can start adding ingredients into your bread. You can do a walnut bread, you can add some spices, you can kind of like do whatever you want. So this is kind of like almost like learning to cook pasta al dente, and then once you learn that, then you can do whatever sauce you want. So this is just about the pure technique. 500 grams of flour. There is no need to sift, there is no need to be too precious about it. This is just one bowl. If you were working with a bulk, like, you know, if you wanted to make 4 or 6 loaves, which is really impossible because if you have one on the oven at home, you cannot have really a cycle because your breads will keep on proofing as one after the other cook. So usually when I throw a party, the top that I can do is really 2 loaves per time. So I just double this recipe. This goes now in the water with the starter. And it can go all together, right? No need to be precious. I'm gonna hold it with my hands and just get in. And you start mixing it. Now, remember last night as we discussed bread starter, mother doughs, and and dry yeast. Aside from the fact that I do have a sourdough starter mixed into that, but there is a big difference between a starter and a mother dough. What I'm working now is my bread without the salt, all right? So there is a fermentation component because there is a yeast from the sourdough base that we're using, and there is flour and water in a really good percentage. This is how my dough is looking for the moment. We haven't done. You want to make sure that you keep on collecting all the flour that is on the side. You see, like this is a wet dough. This is a 70% hydration. This dough stays like this. It cannot be rolled, it cannot be folded just yet. You need to allow it time. So just keep on working. So if you wanted to start the mother dough, and this is something that you can do when you're working with dry yeast as well, once you have a dough like this, you can just grab a little chunk, you put it into a container, and you start feeding that. And you use that to make your bread, or you can dump it into your mix the day after, and the day after, again, take a bite out. This only works if you're not adding salt. If you're adding salt, your mother dough will degrade really, really fast. Okay, so look, this is fairly okay. How can I show you? Okay, so this is a fairly okay dough. It's nice and wet. I scraped it from the side, almost everything. Do not be concerned. This is not an easy dough to work with, but the results are just worth it, so just stick with it. This is a good moment to add the salt. Today I have about, I think, 10-11 grams of salt. You can do a little less. Try not to pass 15 grams, otherwise it gets really, really salty. One of the questions that I got often is, can I use this dough for pizza? Not really. And it's not really a matter of flavor. Obviously the pizza crust has to have a different flavor than this. It has to be a little bit more oily, a little bit more salty. But this is really hard to work. You cannot flatten it. So the only thing that you could do from this is probably a sourdough schiacciata if you were to pour it into a larger container with some olive oil and press it with your fingers and add some salt. But that's really as much as you can do. For the moment, this is just pure sourdough bread making. Okay, look at that. So you see, it has a little bit of a shine. It does have a little bit of a shine. And this is a moment where we put it in the oven and we start the rising process. So let me get my container. One plastic container, easy to access, no lid necessary. Don't use a container that is too wide, otherwise all your dough will flatten to the bottom and you have to scrape it off on the bottom. It's better to have a container that has a little bit of a height to it. Okay? And just like this, without worrying too much, you scrape it with your hand and you let it in. Look at this, you see how sticky this is? Now, one of the interesting things is that as the gluten starts relaxing, as the bacteria start working and doing their job, funny enough, this dough will start developing some texture. And then as we do the fold inside the oven later, I'll show you what I mean by that. Okay, so this is your dough. This dough gets covered and goes into the oven, a bread proofing, for about a half hour. Now, I do realize that we have discussed getting online for all the folds. I do not think it's necessary. I think that we can get together around 1:30 for the bench rest. So allow me to wash my hands and I'll show you how the fold in the bucket happens. This is a process that you will have to repeat every half hour for the next 2 hours. So now I'm doing one even if it's not necessary because I just mixed it, but I'll be here, in a half hour, half hour, and then I'll let it rest for a couple of hours. Let me wash my hands and I'll show you. Okay, back. So basically what's going to happen in a half hour from now, I'll show you now. All right, so this is the process. This goes into the oven. Oh, my cast iron is still here from last night. And this goes in, okay? You pour yourself a coffee, you bring it to your wife upstairs or anywhere she is. You watch some news, you watch Cuomo, you try to figure out if this world is ending or not. And in a half hour you're back. Now, how do you mix that dough without ruining the dough or getting all stuck? So every time that you put your hand in it, because it gets stuck, you remove some of the dough, and you don't want to because you want your weight to stay there. You have to be the size, you have to be quick, and it's only 3 or 4 movements, so there is no need to overdo it. What you're doing now is something that is done for pizza dough, for bread dough, is done all over, especially in bakers that allow themselves time. This is something else that we need to talk about it. Let me show you this and then we'll talk about time. So the best way to fold your dough in the bucket is to get your hand drenched in water. I still have some dough here stuck. So you get your hand wet and then you dig it inside the bucket so the dough doesn't stick. And it's a fast process. The moment that your hand starts drying up, that's where the dough starts sticking, okay? So you do this in a half hour. You get the bucket, let me go wet my hand. Head wet and drenching, okay? In and drop. Grab and drop. Grab and drop. Do it like, right now is a little too early because I just put the dough in, but basically you want to scrape it from the bottom, fold it on itself. Some air gets incorporated, some gluten gets pulled. It is kind of like, it's almost like resuscitating it's like putting paddles on your dough. It's like giving it life. You do this, you cover it again, and it goes back. And then you have to wash your hand again. This is a process that actually you can keep fairly clean. The house doesn't get messy too much. So it's almost 9 o'clock. I consider this my first fold. I'll do 9:30, 10, 10:30, and then I'll let it go. We'll get together at 1. At that point, I'll probably roll my dough there and I'll show you what bench rest is. There is one tool that you will need later. You can use this is a scraper, a regular plastic scraper. You can use this, you can use a metal one. If you don't have it, sometimes when I was desperate, because this stuff falls usually in between drawers at home, you can find, as long as it's something straight and something that you can work with. So sometimes I even have used plastic container lids, anything that is straight that can help you push the dough around. Final comment before I go have coffee and go for a run maybe with the dog. The time, it is 9 o'clock. I usually start my bread much earlier. I told you I developed the recipe based on a Tartine book, right? So their point is that they get together early in the morning so they can have the fresh bread ready around 5 o'clock in the afternoon. So their process starts around 5 in the morning, 4:30 in the morning, something like that. I like to have my bread warm for dinner, but the bread also has to sit. It's a lot of calculation to make it all happen. So basically, if I start baking in the morning when I wake up, especially in school days on a regular day, around 6:30, 7 a.m. So I can start heating my oven in the afternoon around 5 or 5:30, bake around 6 to 7, let my bread rest until 7:30, 7:45, and then cut it open. In Tuscany, they say that the bread is better the day after, and it's true. The bread needs to sit, the crust will compact, it will get a little harder, but it's absolutely nothing that gives you the joy of cutting into a warm loaf of bread and have a super noisy, crunchy crust and a nice, soft, warm interior. It is sexy, it is romantic, it is something that I like to offer my family basically every day, every other day. We don't eat, a 2-pound loaf of bread every day. That is a little too much. My coffee is ready, my ingredients are all here. What do we need to do? That's it. I think this is it, really, for the moment. I'm gonna go exercise a little bit, wash my hands, clean up the kitchen so the wife doesn't get mad when she comes downstairs. I hope the directions were fairly clear for everybody. Again, don't you worry. If I see any questions, I'll go through everything. Ciao Ila. I'll go through everything later and then I'll post all my answers. If this experiment goes well, and I do understand that this is long, the bread is like a super damn long recipe and it requires multiple connection. But if this is working, I think I found something that makes me happy and it's really interesting and fun to do. So if it's not the bread, drop in the comments what you'd like to see being cooked in this kitchen, and maybe we can start having dinners together or aperitivo. Can do some aperitivo together while we're making a pasta sauce, or let's start with something simple and then we'll go back to the big recipes. All right, so fold your dough, wash your hands, keep your kitchen clean, enjoy your morning. I'll see you at 1:30 p.m. Eastern time for the bench rest and to talk a little bit more about the second phase. So happy first rise. Congratulations, thank you for being with me. I got about 600 people connected between Instagram and Facebook, so I'm touched. Thank you so much. Jesus, my hair. I need my wife to shave me. I need to go sit naked in the bathtub and get buzzed. Big kiss to everybody. Enjoy your morning, and we'll see you later. All right? Stay strong. Resist. Finish?